The fluorescent lights flickered, died, came back to life with a violent buzz that cut through the midnight silence of Riverside Manufacturing. Mike Carter's fingers tightened around his flashlight as he moved through the skeletal corridors, his worn security badge catching the harsh light with each deliberate step. 8 months of night shifts had taught him every sound this building made, every hum, every whisper, every breath. But this was different. The server room's steel door radiated an unnatural heat, and behind it, machines screamed in frequencies that shouldn't exist. Red warning lights strobed like a distress signal from another world. Mike pressed his weathered palm against the cold metal, feeling vibrations that crawled up his arm like electric spiders. The patterns were unmistakable to someone who recognized the signature. The attack had begun. "There's something wrong," he whispered to the empty hallway. But who's going to believe a night security guard? Riverside, Pennsylvania, had never been the kind of place where heroes were born. Just another manufacturing town where the smokestacks reached toward gray November skies and the promise of steady work kept families rooted for generations. Mike Carter had arrived here 18 months ago with nothing but a 9-year-old daughter and a heart full of wounds that refused to heal. Sarah's death had shattered more than just his world. It had demolished his identity, his purpose, his belief that hard work and good intentions could protect the people you loved most. The transition from a $120,000 cybersecurity position in Boston to a $12 an hour security guard job in small-town Pennsylvania wasn't just a career change. It was a complete erasure of who he used to be. But Mike had made his choice the moment he watched his daughter Lily cry herself to sleep for the 15th night in a row, asking why mommy couldn't come home from the hospital. Some sacrifices demanded everything, and fatherhood had taught him that love meant showing up, even when showing up meant disappearing from everyone else's expectations. Riverside Manufacturing Corporation occupied 3 city blocks and employed 150 people who depended on steady paychecks to keep their mortgages current and their children in decent schools. The company specialized in medical devices, producing ventilators and cardiac monitors that found their way into hospitals across the eastern seaboard. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential, and that gave the employees a sense of purpose that extended beyond their individual struggles. Mike's supervisor had hired him through a temp agency, appreciating his reliability and his ability to complete incident reports without spelling errors. The background check had revealed an 18-month gap in employment history, but desperate employers rarely questioned qualified candidates who showed up on time and didn't steal from the supply closet. What they didn't know was that Mike spent his daytime hours helping Lily with homework, attending parent-teacher conferences, and learning to braid hair from YouTube videos that made him cry when he thought no one was watching. The CEO, Robert Sullivan, occupied the top floor of the main building, like a general surveying his domain. Rob had graduated from Harvard Business School with honors and had been recruited to save the company from declining profits and increased competition from overseas manufacturers. At 45, he had devoted his entire adult life to climbing corporate ladders, sacrificing 2 marriages and countless personal relationships on the altar of professional success. He measured his worth in quarterly reports and board meeting presentations, and he had little patience for employees who couldn't contribute to the bottom line. Their first encounter had been unremarkable. Mike had been completing his rounds when he noticed lights still burning in the executive suite at 11:45 on a Tuesday night. Professional curiosity had driven him to investigate, and he'd found Rob hunched over financial projections, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his usually perfect hair disheveled from hours of running his hands through it. The CEO had looked up with tired eyes and asked if everything was secure, and Mike had simply nodded and offered to bring him coffee from the break room vending machine. That small gesture had surprised Rob more than it should have. Most employees either cowered in his presence or approached him with ulterior motives. But Mike had simply recognized another human being working too hard and too late. The coffee had been terrible, but the kindness behind it had been genuine, and Rob had found himself looking forward to those brief interactions during his increasingly frequent late-night sessions. He began to notice that Mike's security reports were unusually detailed and well-written, with observations that demonstrated genuine concern for the company's welfare. Mike, meanwhile, had begun to recognize the signs of a man drowning in responsibilities he couldn't delegate. Rob's expensive clothing couldn't hide the exhaustion in his posture, and his authoritative demeanor couldn't mask the loneliness that seemed to follow him through the empty corridors. Mike had learned to read people during his years in corporate environments, and he could see that Rob's success had come at a cost that might not have been worth paying. The coffee became a routine. Mike would appear at Rob's door around midnight, carrying 2 cups of the barely drinkable brew from the ancient vending machine, and they would spend 15 minutes discussing everything except the obvious tension building around the company's future. Rob learned that Mike had a daughter who was struggling with fractions, and that he'd been teaching himself to cook by watching cooking shows after she went to bed. Mike learned that Rob had been working 16-hour days trying to secure a $50 million contract that would determine whether the company survived the next fiscal year. Their conversations never touched on personal history. Mike didn't mention his previous career or the circumstances that had brought him to Pennsylvania, and Rob didn't discuss the failed relationships that had left him isolated in his success. They were two men who had learned to guard their vulnerabilities, finding an odd comfort in the superficial safety of their professional roles. But beneath the surface, something resembling friendship had begun to grow, built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that everyone carries burdens that others can't see. One evening, Mike had noticed a security flaw in the parking lot lighting system and had written a detailed report with suggestions for improvement. Rob had read it twice, impressed by the thoroughness of the analysis and the practical nature of the recommendations. When he'd complimented Mike on his attention to detail, the security guard had simply shrugged and said he'd noticed things that seemed important. It was the kind of response that made Rob curious about the man behind the uniform, but he'd never found the courage to ask the questions that might have revealed uncomfortable truths. The routine had continued for months until the night everything changed. Mike had been making his usual rounds when he'd discovered an IT employee's workstation still logged into the company's network at 2 a.m. Following protocol, he'd immediately contacted Rob, who had been impressed by Mike's quick thinking and adherence to security procedures. The incident had been minor, but it had demonstrated Mike's reliability and his genuine concern for the company's welfare. Rob had begun to wonder if he'd been underestimating the man who brought him coffee and asked thoughtful questions about business operations. But wondering and understanding were different things entirely. Rob had built his career on the assumption that hierarchy existed for good reasons, and that people who worked night security jobs did so because they lacked the skills or education for more demanding positions. Mike's insights and observations had challenged that assumption, but Rob had found it easier to dismiss them as lucky guesses rather than evidence of hidden competence. The cognitive dissonance was uncomfortable, and Rob had chosen to ignore it rather than confront the possibility that his worldview might be fundamentally flawed. The discovery that Mike possessed extensive knowledge of computer systems had unsettled Rob more than he'd cared to admit. When the email server had experienced technical difficulties, Mike had quietly suggested a solution that would have saved the company $5,000 in contractor fees. Rob had rejected the suggestion out of hand, not because it was wrong, but because accepting it would have required acknowledging that a security guard might understand technology better than he did. The decision had been motivated by pride rather than logic, and both men had recognized the uncomfortable truth without discussing it directly. The tension between them had grown gradually, like a crack in a foundation that spreads slowly until it threatens the entire structure. Mike had continued to perform his duties with quiet competence, while Rob had begun to question whether his employee's helpfulness crossed the line into presumption. The balance of their relationship had shifted from mutual respect to mutual wariness, each man protecting himself from truths that might have been too difficult to accept. Mike's written report recommending comprehensive security upgrades had been the final straw. Rob had read the document 3 times, recognizing the expertise behind the recommendations, while simultaneously resenting the implication that a night security guard could identify problems that the company's IT department had missed. The report had been filed away without implementation, and Rob had made a mental note to establish clearer boundaries regarding employee responsibilities and appropriate communication channels. The unspoken message had been clear. Mike was overstepping his role, and Rob intended to remind him of his place in the company hierarchy. Neither man had realized that their personal insecurities were about to collide with circumstances that would test every assumption they'd made about each other, about themselves, and about the true nature of heroism in an age when the greatest threats were invisible and the most valuable skills were often hidden behind the most humble facades. The ransomware attack began at 1:15 in the morning on a Friday in late November, when most of the world was asleep and the skeleton crew of night shift workers was focused on routine maintenance and security procedures. The hackers had chosen their timing carefully, knowing that reduced staffing would delay detection and response. They had also chosen their target carefully, recognizing that a medical device manufacturer would be particularly vulnerable to extortion because any disruption in production could literally cost lives. Mike had been completing his hourly rounds when he'd first noticed the unusual sounds coming from the server room. 8 months of night shifts had taught him to recognize the building's normal rhythms, and the high-pitched whine of overworked cooling fans and the irregular clicking of stressed hard drives had immediately caught his attention. The red warning lights had confirmed his suspicions, and the heat radiating from the server room door had told him that something was seriously wrong. The attack had been sophisticated, designed to encrypt critical production data while simultaneously demanding payment in untraceable cryptocurrency. The hackers had left a message on every computer screen in the building. Your systems are encrypted. Pay $2 million in Bitcoin within 48 hours or all data will be permanently deleted. Do not contact authorities. Do not attempt to decrypt files. Payment instructions will be provided upon compliance. The threat was clear, and the consequences of non-compliance would be catastrophic. Mike had immediately called Rob, knowing that the CEO needed to be informed of the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. The phone had rung 6 times before Rob had answered, his voice thick with sleep and irritation at being awakened in the middle of the night. When Mike had explained the situation, Rob's first instinct had been to question whether a security guard was qualified to assess computer problems, and his second instinct had been to assert his authority over the situation. "You're just a security guard," Rob had said, his voice sharp with the kind of dismissive certainty that comes from years of being the smartest person in the room. "Don't try to be something you're not." The words had been spoken in frustration and fear, but they had landed like physical blows, carrying with them months of accumulated tension and unspoken resentment. Mike had absorbed the insult in silence, recognizing that Rob's panic was making him cruel, but understanding that cruelty born of fear could be just as damaging as cruelty born of malice. Rob had arrived at the company within 30 minutes, his hair still disheveled from sleep and his clothes hastily thrown on over pajamas. He had immediately called the company's IT contractor, agreeing to pay emergency rates of $500 per hour for immediate assistance. The contractor had arrived an hour later, taken one look at the encrypted systems, and announced that recovery would take between 24 and 48 hours, assuming the hackers hadn't installed additional malware designed to corrupt backup systems. Mike had tried to explain that he could stop the attack, that he understood the attack vectors and could isolate the infected systems before they compromised the backup servers. But Rob had been beyond listening, his panic and pride combining into a toxic mixture that made him incapable of accepting help from someone he'd already dismissed as incompetent. The irony was lost on both men that the person most qualified to solve the problem was the one person whose expertise Rob refused to acknowledge. The ultimatum had been clear. Mike could follow orders and stay out of the way, or he could face immediate termination for insubordination. Rob had been operating from a playbook that prioritized chain of command over problem solving, and he had convinced himself that maintaining authority was more important than finding solutions. Mike had recognized the impossible position he'd been placed in, but he had also recognized that 150 families depended on paychecks that wouldn't exist if the company failed to recover from the attack. The decision had been agonizing. Mike had spent 18 months building a stable life for himself and his daughter, and losing his job would have meant starting over again in a world that wasn't particularly forgiving to single fathers without traditional credentials. But he had also spent years developing expertise that could save the company, and he had spent months watching Rob work himself to exhaustion trying to secure contracts that would keep everyone employed. The choice between personal security and collective welfare had been clear, even if the consequences were terrifying. Mike had waited until Rob and the IT contractor had left the building before accessing the server room with his security keycard. The sight that had greeted him was worse than he'd expected. Dozens of servers running at maximum capacity, their cooling systems screaming in protest, as the ransomware systematically encrypted terabytes of critical data. The attack was more sophisticated than typical ransomware, with multiple redundancies designed to prevent exactly the kind of intervention Mike was attempting. But Mike had seen this pattern before, had spent years studying the digital fingerprints that different hacking groups left behind. He had recognized the attack signatures, understood the methodology, and most importantly, he had known how to build the kind of isolation protocols that could stop the encryption process without triggering the malware's self-destruct sequences. Working alone in the humming server room, he had begun the delicate process of saving a company that had never bothered to learn his real name. The work had required 6 hours of continuous concentration, his fingers flying across keyboards as he traced attack vectors and built firewalls around critical systems. Each line of code had been a small victory against an enemy that existed only in the digital realm, and each successful isolation had brought him closer to a solution that would preserve jobs and livelihoods that extended far beyond the company's immediate employees. The weight of responsibility had been crushing, but it had also been familiar, reminding him of the person he used to be before grief had forced him to disappear. By 7 in the morning, Mike had successfully isolated the ransomware, prevented it from accessing the backup servers, and restored most of the company's critical systems. The attack had been neutralized, the production schedules had been preserved, and the $50 million contract that Rob had been pursuing was no longer in jeopardy. It had been the kind of victory that should have been celebrated, but Mike had known that his unauthorized actions would be seen as insubordination rather than heroism. Rob had returned to the office at 8:30, expecting to find chaos and devastation. Instead, he had found Mike collapsed beside a keyboard, his body finally succumbing to the exhaustion and stress of a night that had demanded everything he had to give. The paramedics had been called, and as they had prepared to transport Mike to the hospital, his personal belongings had spilled from his locker, revealing secrets that would change everything both men thought they knew about each other. The laptop had been ancient by modern standards, its plastic case scarred and yellowed with age, but its contents had been revolutionary. Rob had opened it expecting to find personal photos and simple documents, but instead he had discovered a portfolio of cybersecurity projects that rivaled anything he'd seen from consultants charging 10 times Mike's hourly wage. The awards and certifications had been impressive, but the resignation letter from TechCorp had been devastating in its quiet dignity. "I am submitting my resignation effective immediately," the letter had read. "My wife's passing has made it clear that my priorities must shift entirely to caring for my daughter. I cannot in good conscience continue to work the demanding hours that this position requires when my child needs me to be present for her healing process. I want to thank you for the opportunities you've provided and for your understanding during this difficult time." The photographs had been the final revelation. Sarah Carter had been beautiful in the way that photographers struggle to capture, her smile radiant with the kind of joy that comes from being deeply loved. Lily had been smaller in the photos, her gap-toothed grin and pigtails making her look like every father's dream of childhood innocence. But it had been the photo of Mike that had broken Rob's heart. A man in an expensive suit, confident and successful, holding his family like they were the most precious things in the world. Rob had sat in the hospital waiting room for 4 hours, the laptop balanced on his knees as he scrolled through code that demonstrated a level of expertise he'd never suspected. The man he'd dismissed as just a security guard had been one of the most skilled cybersecurity professionals on the East Coast, and he'd given it all up to make pancakes for his daughter and help her with homework. The sacrifice had been total, and Rob had finally understood that heroism came in many forms, most of them invisible to the people who benefited from them. When Mike had finally awakened, Rob had been sitting beside his bed, the laptop open to a page of code that had saved the company from bankruptcy. The silence between them had been heavy with unspoken apologies and belated recognition, and when Lily had asked if her father was going to be fired, Rob had realized that his response would define not just Mike's future, but his own character as well. "No, sweetheart," Rob had said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "Your daddy is going to be just fine. We're going to make sure of that." The promise had been simple, but it had carried the weight of a man's recognition that some mistakes can only be corrected through changed behavior, not just changed words. 3 months later, the transformation had been complete but subtle. Mike had retained his security guard position, but he had also been appointed as the company's part-time chief technology officer, a hybrid role that allowed him to maintain his flexible schedule while contributing his expertise to the company's long-term security strategy. The arrangement had been unprecedented, but Rob had learned that unprecedented times called for unprecedented solutions. The Security Innovation Program had been Mike's brainchild, a comprehensive approach to cybersecurity that combined traditional physical security with cutting-edge digital protection. Under his guidance, the company had not only recovered from the ransomware attack, but had emerged stronger and more resilient than before. The $50 million contract had been signed, and the company had expanded its workforce by 50 employees, all of whom owed their jobs to a man who had risked everything to do what was right. Rob had also changed, though his transformation had been more personal than professional. He had learned to delegate authority and to recognize expertise regardless of its packaging, and he had discovered that leadership meant lifting others up rather than keeping them in their assigned places. The company's success had become a collaborative effort rather than a one-man show, and the results had exceeded everyone's expectations. On a Tuesday evening in February, Mike, Lily, and Rob had been sharing pizza in the company cafeteria when Lily had asked Rob why he'd been so mean to her daddy. The question had been asked with the kind of innocent directness that only children can manage, and Rob had struggled to find an answer that would satisfy both a 9-year-old's curiosity and his own need for absolution. "I was scared," Rob had finally admitted. "When people are scared, they sometimes say things they don't mean and make decisions they shouldn't make. Your daddy was trying to help, but I was too scared to listen. I'm sorry about that." The apology had been simple, but it had been honest, and Lily had accepted it with the kind of grace that comes naturally to children who have learned to forgive. Mike had watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, recognizing that Rob's transformation had been as significant as his own. The man who had once dismissed him as just a security guard had become a mentor to his daughter and a genuine friend to his family. The relationship had evolved beyond professional necessity into something resembling brotherhood, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to be responsible for others. The laptop had found its permanent home on Mike's desk in his new office, a small space adjacent to the security station that allowed him to monitor both physical and digital threats. Lily had decorated it with stickers that proclaimed Daddy's computer and world's best IT guy, and Rob had pretended not to notice when she'd also added one that said Rob's friend. The decorations had been childish, but they had represented a truth that both men had learned to value. The photo of Sarah had remained on the desk as well, no longer hidden but displayed with pride beside pictures of Lily's school achievements and family outings that now sometimes included Rob. The grief had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into something more manageable, a permanent sadness that coexisted with new joys and unexpected friendships. Mike had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting, and that honoring the past didn't prevent him from building a future. As winter had given way to spring, the rhythm of their lives had settled into something approaching normalcy. Mike continued his night shifts, but now he split his time between security rounds and monitoring the sophisticated computer systems that protected the company from digital threats. Rob had learned to leave the office at reasonable hours, often stopping by Mike's desk to discuss security protocols or to ask about Lily's progress in school. The company had thrived under their collaborative leadership, and the story of the security guard who had saved the company from bankruptcy had become local legend. But Mike had insisted that the real story was about recognition, about the importance of seeing people for who they truly were rather than who they appeared to be. He had learned that heroism was less about grand gestures and more about showing up when it mattered, even when showing up meant risking everything you'd worked to build. On a quiet Thursday evening in April, Mike had been completing his rounds when he'd noticed Rob's office light still burning at 11:30. The sight had been familiar, but this time Mike had knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission. Rob had looked up from his paperwork with a smile that had become genuine over the months, and Mike had set down 2 cups of coffee this time from the good machine in the executive break room. "Working late again?" Mike had asked, settling into the chair across from Rob's desk with the easy familiarity of friendship. "Just finishing up the quarterly reports," Rob had replied, gesturing at the papers spread across his desk. "The board is going to be very happy with our performance metrics. We're exceeding projections in every category." Mike had nodded, understanding that the company's success was measured not just in profits but in the security of the jobs it provided and the families it supported. The ransomware attack had been a crisis, but it had also been an opportunity for both men to discover who they really were when everything they'd built was threatened. Lily's science fair project won first place, Mike had said, pulling out his phone to show Rob the photo of his daughter beaming beside a display about renewable energy. "She wants to be an engineer when she grows up. Says she wants to build things that help people." Rob had studied the photo with the kind of attention he usually reserved for financial reports, noting the pride in Lily's expression and the way her father's love shone through even in a simple cell phone picture. "She's going to be amazing," he had said. "She's got her father's intelligence and her mother's heart." The conversation had continued for another hour, touching on everything from company policies to weekend plans to the difficulty of single parenthood. It had been the kind of conversation that friends have, unmarked by the hierarchies and formalities that had once defined their relationship. They had discovered that they had more in common than either had expected, and that their differences had made them stronger rather than weaker. As Mike had prepared to leave, Rob had made a decision that surprised both of them. "I want you to know," he had said, his voice careful but sincere, "that you're the best hire I've ever made. Not because of your technical skills, though those are impressive, because of your character. You risked everything to do what was right, even when doing what was right might have cost you everything. Mike had been quiet for a moment, processing the compliment and the man who had offered it. "I didn't have a choice," he had finally said. "When you know you can help, you have to help." That's what Sarah used to say. That's what I want to teach Lily. Rob had nodded, understanding that some lessons can only be learned through experience, and that the most important experiences are often the most difficult ones. The ransomware attack had been a crisis that had revealed character, and both men had discovered that they were capable of more than they'd previously imagined. The security guard who had saved the company from bankruptcy had never sought recognition or reward, but he had found something more valuable than either: the satisfaction of knowing that his actions had mattered, that his sacrifices had meaning, and that the people he cared about were safe and secure. The CEO, who had nearly lost everything because of his pride, had learned that true leadership meant recognizing excellence regardless of its source, and that the most important decisions are often made in moments of crisis when character matters more than credentials. Years later, when people asked about the night that changed everything, both men would remember different details but the same essential truth: that heroism is not about being the strongest or the smartest or the most successful, but about being willing to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done, regardless of the personal cost. The security guard had saved the company, but the company had saved the security guard as well, giving him a place where his skills mattered and his sacrifices were valued. The laptop still sat on Mike's desk, its stickers faded but its contents updated with new projects and new challenges. The photo of Sarah remained beside it, a reminder of love that transcends loss and sacrifice that creates meaning. And somewhere in the building, a CEO worked reasonable hours and a security guard walked his rounds, both of them understanding that the most important victories are often the ones that no one sees coming.